Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction and, of course, for the warm hospitality. I hope you clap at the end as well. Let me address the issue of what we know and what we think Iran is doing by telling you a story. There's a man who lives through many years of a happy marriage until one day he realizes that his wife is not coming back home at the usual times anymore. She's a little more distant. She's suddenly changed her hairstyle. She's bought a whole new set of clothing. So after going through the pain and the angst of doubt and suspicion and fear, he hires a private eye. Private eye follows the wife for a number of days and then comes back with a report. He says, "Sir, I followed your wife after you left home to go to work in the morning. She went to a cafe nearby. She met a very distinguished gentleman. They were fairly affectionate. They sat down and had coffee together. And then they came back home. They walked into the house, and I was able to position myself in an adjacent building overlooking your bedroom. And after a few minutes, I saw them walking into the bedroom, and they took their clothes off. And he got into the bed. And the man says, 'What did my wife do?' The private eye says, 'Well, I'm sorry, sir, but she closed the curtains.'" So that's where we are when it comes to Iran's quest for nuclear weapons and what they really are doing. We don't have that kind of evidence, but that's as far as we have gone in terms of determining and understanding their intent and their motive. However, one interesting question, which has to do with the countdown to a nuclear Iran, and I have to, by the way, apologize in advance because I will say a lot more about Iran than I will say about Israel, is how is it possible, if Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons, that Iran has been doing so without success for 28 years? Because the nuclear program of the Islamic Republic of Iran had a nuclear program under the Shah, which intelligence services in the West believed was geared towards a military goal. But that program was disbanded in 1979. The Islamic Republic reassembled the program in 1984 at the height of the Iran-Iraq War. And in 2012, Iran still does not have, at least as far as we know. And I think that if they had gone to the point of building nuclear weapons, they would have let the world know. So we can assume that they still don't have it. 28 years is a long time. The Soviets took 4 years. The Chinese took 5. The North Koreans, if I remember correctly, took something pretty much the same amount of time. So why is Iran taking so long? Does that tell us something about Iran's intentions? Or does that tell us about Iran's capabilities? Or maybe does that tell us something about Iran's adversaries' ability to interfere with Iran's program? And I think that I will leave the issue of intentions aside because it's very difficult to gauge the thinking of Iran's decision makers on a whole range of issues, including nuclear. But I want to focus on trying to explain why Iran, to this very day, hasn't managed to cross the critical threshold, assuming that they want to. And say something about the policies that could avoid the kind of policy dilemmas which Israel and indeed the West as a whole would have to face if we had conclusive, undisputable evidence that Iran is about to cross the finish line. The two key things about understanding why Iran has gotten so close to the nuclear weapon, but hasn't succeeded yet despite the amount of time and resources it has invested into this endeavor. The two key points are, one, the exposure of the Iranian nuclear program and what that has entailed for Iran's ability to progress. And two, the combination of policies, overt and covert, that have, over the years, cost Iran a significant delay in its efforts. These are the two main reasons why Iran, in 2012, still cannot test a nuclear weapon and deploy a nuclear arsenal. Let me explain. Iran needs to enrich uranium to 90-something% in order to have fissile material to build a nuclear weapon. Iran also needs to weaponize in order to be able to have nuclear weapons, and it needs the technology and the know-how to miniaturize that nuclear weapon and fit it into a warhead for a missile. Iran, last but not least, needs to develop the missile technology to deliver the weapon to its enemies. Now, Iran has pretty much developed the missile technology indigenously. Iran has tested missiles that are not based anymore on Scud missiles, which it received from North Korea in the past, in recent times. There is no conclusive evidence that Iran has succeeded in working out a way to fit a non-conventional warhead into such missiles, although there are indications that they have been trying and making some progress. Iran has succeeded in its endeavor to enrich uranium to 19.75%, and therefore Iran has the capability, if it chooses to do so, to enrich to weapons-grade levels. The problem for Iran is not capability so much when it comes to enrichment. The problem with Iran is that Iran's enrichment activity have been exposed and are currently under full surveillance and monitoring by the international community through the International Atomic Energy Agency. In other words, had the facility, the main enrichment facility that Iran has in Natanz, not been exposed in 2002, as it was, you may recall that there was a briefing in Washington given by one opposition group, and there is a whole unresolved question as to whether the opposition group actually discovered that evidence on its own, or whether that evidence was passed to them by some Western intelligence service to give that exposure perhaps more credibility. But whatever the case, that facility was exposed in 2000. Once it was exposed, Iran could not make a run for it in those premises. A second covert enrichment facility was exposed in 2009. That's the facility near home, which is built under the mountain, which is very hard to penetrate by military means, and which is designed to host approximately 3,000 centrifuges, which in commercial terms doesn't make any sense. So it looks like that facility was designed specifically for military purposes. Some of you may be familiar, by the way, with the National Intelligence Estimate that the US intelligence agencies published in 2007, alleging that Iran had suspended its nuclear military program in 2003, and in that estimate, there is a footnote that explains what they mean by suspension of the weaponization activities, and they talk about weaponization and covert enrichment. So 2009 proves that the exposure of this facility proves that Iran actually, that that assessment was correct insofar as ongoing covert activities, perhaps not entirely accurate about their suspension. Iran was building a covert enrichment facility. Had that facility not been exposed in 2009, once again, Iran would have had the time frame and the technology to enrich all the way to weapons grade. Because these two facilities have been exposed, we have to assume two possibilities. One, that Iran is building another covert facility and we don't know about it yet. Or that Iran is not building a covert facility, and if it chooses to weaponize and cross the threshold, it will use the two known facilities which are under surveillance. If they're building a new facility, we don't have evidence of that. We can assume, knowing what happened and how long it took them in Natanz and in Fordo, that they may be a year or 2 years away from having an operational enrichment facility that is covert. If Iran is going to use the facilities we know about, then Iran has a problem, and that may explain why they're going so slowly. What is the problem? The problem has to do with the speed by which they can enrich all the way to 90%. They have a number of centrifuges active both in Natanz and as of late 2011 in Fordo. But at the rate by which they enrich, if Iran today wanted to feed into these centrifuges the stockpile of low-enriched uranium it has in order to produce high-enriched uranium for nuclear weapons, it would take them approximately 4 months to produce enough high-enriched uranium for the first rudimentary bomb. Now, they are under 24-hour CCTV surveillance, and inspectors come at least once a month to do surveillance of the property, to verify the performance of the centrifuges, to assess the inventory of accumulated low-enriched uranium, and so on. So if Iran chose to use these facilities now, by the time Iran has produced enough uranium for the first bomb, Iran has already been caught red-handed. And the activities leading up to that achievement would most likely trigger a military attack. So that explains why, at least for the time being, and I leave aside, as I explained before, the question of political intentions and political calculations, Iran will not do that. But it may do that if the centrifuges that it is using perform better. If the rate at which they enrich uranium increases, or if Iran is able to install new generation centrifuges, and they're testing new generation centrifuges at the moment, then the time frame they have to enrich to weapons grade uranium within a monitor facility shrinks considerably, and so therefore they may choose to do it even under the nose of the international. Now, one of the reasons why their centrifuges have been poorly performing, and that leads me to the second point, is of course that these centrifuges can work well based on the quality of the material they're built with and the technology that they use. And in both cases, Iran, for a long time, did not have the indigenous capacity to produce either. Iran is trying to develop the indigenous capacity to build centrifuges either with maraging steel. There are reports that they are trying to develop that capacity in a new factory near the city of Mossad. And Iran inaugurated last year, in April, if I remember correctly, a production facility for chitin fiber, which would be the alternative material to use for these kind of machines. But until then, and there is no evidence, by the way, that the quality of the products made in Iran can match the ones that Iran cannot no longer import from the West. There is no evidence, therefore, that Iran can produce on its own good, well-performing centrifuges. As long as that doesn't happen, the machinery that Iran has is performing rather poorly, which explains why, although the production of low-enriched uranium inside the known facilities has slightly increased, that has come at the price of using more and more centrifuges. So Iran has a problem of supply of raw material, it has a problem with the technology it is using, and the sanctions have caused a significant slowdown in the program, precisely because since 2002, and even more so after 2007, when the first round of UN sanctions were passed, Iran has found it increasingly difficult to procure the material it needs to improve the performance, which would allow Iran to enrich at a faster pace and therefore reach the level of weapons-grade fissile material even under surveillance before it actually gets pulled and it suffers the consequences. So that is another element of the explanation. And that is overt interference with the program through sanctions. And I'm happy to go through sort of a more detailed description of how these sanctions work and how they have severely affected Iran's ability to move forward. The third, of course, element in this equation is the covert aspect of interference with Iran's program. Now, the one element that gets people talking more, of course, is the mysterious premature death of Iranian nuclear scientists. Of course, that's because it evokes, James Bond-like situations, which we can romanticize about. But the truth is that the real damages caused to the nuclear program in Iran through covert action have much less to do with the killing of a few scientists. I mean, this is a program that has a 28-year history, which means a very strong body of accumulated collective knowledge. It has thousands of people involved in the program, and frankly speaking, whoever did the killing, 5 scientists in 3 years, is not going to change the equation. There is, of course, an element that makes Iran preoccupied when it comes to the killing of scientists. It's less to do with the loss of knowledge and the performance. It has more to do with the level of penetration of the program by Western intelligence services, to know who the scientists are, where they live, which one is the car they drive to work, and how to find them in Tehran morning traffic indicates a high level of human intelligence available to enemies, which suggests in turn that there are sources inside the program willing to sell out their colleagues in exchange for whatever payoffs. And that, of course, does not only increase paranoia, but it increases the burden of securing the program, protecting the scientists, ensuring that these occurrences don't happen in the future. But I think the more important point in the covert operations has to do with the fact that over the years, Western intelligence services have been able to conduct a number of actions which led to A, the selling of faulty technology to Iran. Iran cannot buy overtly certain technology on the international market because of sanctions. Iran tries to do so covertly through front companies, through smuggling networks. Western intelligence services have often penetrated these networks and have ensured that Iran would buy faulty technology. The most glaring and famous example is the story of Stuxnet. Stuxnet was supplied to Iran through a USB memory key. So somebody actually went to the facilities, to the nuclear facilities, had access to the nuclear facilities, and was able to bring this virus onto these facilities after the computers that were used to run these facilities had also been interfered and tampered with by Western intelligence services. Stuxnet, by the way, had one interesting effect. It caused the centrifuges to spin in a way that actually caused the irreparable damage of a significant number of such centrifuges. So once again, if Iran has difficulty supplying the technology for the centrifuges, it can't build it on its own at a high enough level of a qualitative level technologically speaking. It has to rely on faulty or underperforming centrifuges that it cannot replace or cannot replace that easily. And 1,000 out of the 9,000 ones installed in Natanz all of a sudden spin out of control and break down because of Stuxnet, then that also explains the delay. So in short, the countdown to a nuclear Iran can be considerably stretched as long as this combination of covert activities and overt activities that preempt and prevent Iran from accessing the technology and the know-how needed to proceed continue. And as long as intelligence is focused on ensuring that we discover covert facilities before they can actually come into line. If all of this continues to function as it has until now, then Iran's nuclear program is likely to continue on for maybe another 28 years without a nuclear weapon coming into the production line, regardless of the intentions. And as long as these operations continue and the sanctions regime is effective in preventing Iran from accessing the kind of know-how and technology it needs to finish the job, then there is time for diplomacy. President Sarkozy of France, spoke of the terrible dilemma of either bombing Iran or living with Iranian bomb. Students of international relations and political science are often taught that there is always a worst-case scenario. And this is one of those rare occurrences in history when you actually have two worst-case scenarios. Bombing Iran is a worst-case scenario, but living with an Iranian bomb for a variety of reasons is also a worst-case scenario. And ensuring that diplomacy has enough time to avoid both should continue to be the purpose of the international community. I think that the dual-track approach has had its own failures, and I have been skeptical, and I'm on record for being skeptical about it, because I think it lacks two fundamental components. It does currently lack a credible threat to military action. It doesn't help to have Western leaders constantly highlighting in a public fashion that they're against it, and that they don't think it will work because Iran fears a military attack. I think that a credible threat would enhance the likelihood of a diplomatic, non-violent success of our endeavor to stop Iran. And I also think that it has been so far a mistake to invest significant efforts of our diplomacy in reassuring Iran that we do not want to support their own internal oppositions. Because if Iran was a different regime and acted in a more benign fashion towards its own citizens and more responsibly as an international player, it would be infinitely easier to address Iran's nuclear ambitions as well as Iran's nuclear rights. Be that as it may, diplomacy can only work if the timeline is stretched and the countdown is slowed down. If Iran feels that it is close enough that it can actually make a run for it before the sanctions that are about to be deployed with the oil embargo actually bite and have an effect on its own economy, Iran will march forward to a nuclear weapon. As long as they know that doing so will be caught before they actually succeed, we have more time to win this struggle with Iran through diplomacy. Striking a nuclear facility has two precedents, as you know. One is the Israeli attack on Mossad in 1981. The other one is Operation Overture against Syria in 2007. Both carried out by Israel. Both attacks involved complex operations, although clearly infinitely less complex than what an attack on Iran would look like. Both events took place at a relatively early stage of both nuclear programs. When it comes to Iran, you're way beyond that stage. So that in and of itself tells you how the Israelis themselves view the challenge. They would much rather see this solved through diplomacy, sanctions, and other non-military means. I think that the view from Israel is that the diplomatic efforts and the sanctions have not achieved the goal of preventing or dissuading Iran from pursuing nuclear weapons, and they're likely ultimately to fail. Now, the Israelis have not only a different threat perception than, say, the Americans or the Europeans or other Western countries such as Australia. They're much closer to Iran. Iran has voiced very explicitly and bluntly its ideological enmity to Israel. Israel is, involved in a hot and cold war with Iranian proxies on its borders, so they have a different threat perception, but they also have a different set of capabilities when it comes to preventing Iran from going nuclear than, say, NATO/America. America can afford to see Iran bringing most of its enrichment activities deep underground in the new facility near Qom, and still be able to destroy it if it chooses to do so in a year's time, 2 years' time. Israel can't do that, unless, of course, the Americans make certain technological tools available to Israel, which they haven't so far. So I think that explains the sense of urgency you hear in Netanyahu's word. I think that the key element of Netanyahu's speech last week in Washington was actually the reference to the fact that Israel will not allow the fate of the Jewish people to ever be in the hands of someone else. What it means is that Netanyahu is not prepared to find himself in a situation where, for Israel's capabilities, it is too late to strike Iran's nuclear program out of existence, and it has to rely on the goodwill of an American president, or anyone else for that matter. The trade-off there, of course, would be for the American president to say, give us more time, and we'll give you that technological edge you don't have yet. And there's been speculation in the media that indeed that conversation has taken place. When we do not have the perfect understanding of the other side, when the other side does not have the full grasp of understanding of how we think, and we do not have the same quality and quantity of channels of communication and instruments to use to diffuse tensions and to de-escalate potential conflicts when that happens. The fact that the Cold War did not develop into a full-fledged nuclear exchange does not mean that the Cold War was a pleasant affair. Okay? Now, you can't say we can deter them, rational actors, Soviet Union, Cold War, peace for 45 years. I can say that because I lived in a country for my entire existence during the Cold War, which enjoyed a relative level of prosperity under the American nuclear umbrella and thanks to nature truce diplomacy. But if you were Polish, if you were Czech, if you were, even worse, if you were Cambodian, or if you were somewhere in Central America or in the Horn of Africa, you might have a slightly less optimistic view of what the Cold War entails when two superpowers cannot fight it out all the way and therefore use proxies in the way they, challenge their respective spheres of influence. So I take your point entirely. Iran is not going to launch a first strike the day it has the bomb. I take your point entirely that they're not crazy, apocalyptic, millenarian, messianic, etc., etc. But I have to disagree profoundly with you on the assumption that therefore everything will be rosy. I would much rather have liked to see Western leaders not to sort of extensively debate the pros and cons of a military action. I think that a credible military threat is a useful tool to enhance your diplomatic efforts. That if your adversary thinks that you're crazy enough to do it, they may be more reasonable at the negotiating table. And so a credible threat actually may thwart the actual, the actuation of that threat. However, for a number of years, we have had Western leaders all the way up to the top of the decision-making, the chain of command in Western political systems, and military commanders of very senior ranks, actually voicing the opposite, making statements to the extent that a military threat is not credible, is catastrophic, it would be terrible to use it. And so I think that much of the talk now about an imminent military strike against Iran and the likelihood of a military strike and whether it will be easy or hard, useful or useless, is an aim to recalibrate the damage done in terms of deterrence to that talk. I would have much preferred not to see all of this in the public domain. I think that this is a conversation to be had inside the Prime Minister's office or the President's office, where hard questions have to be asked all the time and should be asked all the time. Now, I haven't polled the Iranian population myself, and I am very doubtful that polls in a country like Iran can actually offer us the reflection of a very informed opinion. It is possible that if Iran tomorrow were to test a nuclear weapon and the Supreme Leader went on the national media and announced it to Iranians and said, this is a great accomplishment for our nation, people would take pride. I don't discount that. But I am of the impression that actually the regime hasn't told the full truth to its people about their nuclear program. Iranians do not know that 28 years and dozens of billions of dollars have been spent for a nuclear program meant to produce nuclear energy which hasn't yielded yet one single watt of electricity, at least if one discounts the last 2 months of operational, of the fact that Bushehr has become operational. But until then, nothing has been produced. The Iranian people may be only dimly aware of the kind of political and economic price that the country is paying on account of Iran's nuclear program. Iranians may not necessarily be fully aware of the fact that if Iran complied with its NPT obligations, it would be fully entitled to pursue peaceful nuclear energy, and actually the West would be willing to help Iran pursue that goal under safer conditions than there are inside Iran at present. So if you put all of these pieces of information on the table, it actually might be that the Iranian people will still want nuclear energy, but may be much more critical of the regime when it comes to the way it has conducted itself. I am on record very, very extensively on the subject of sanctions. I wrote a book about it, and I think that sanctions have had one significant success, and that is they have succeeded in slowing down the program significantly through a variety of measures, which include targeting the financial sector, they include targeting the transport sector, they include going after the procurement efforts, shutting down procurement activities, shutting down smuggling routes, etc., etc., etc. These measures have been successful. They haven't stopped the program, but they have bought us an enormous amount of time. Where sanctions have failed so far is actually the main goal that they have, which is to persuade the regime to change course. And I am on record criticizing the sanctions for having failed to do so, and for have not criticized Western leaders for having failed to implement very tough sanctions much earlier in the game, before Iran was in a position to enrich on its own, before Iran had accumulated the stockpile of uranium that it has, etc., etc., etc. There is only so much consensus internationally about how extensively sanctions can go. So the sanctions regime that is in place today is the second best option. Can this have the kind of impact that we hope to see? At least those ones who think that preventing a nuclear Iran is desirable. I think that we have a narrow window of opportunity. You're right that there are free riders, and that makes the sanction less effective. But even so, when we start walking into the oil embargo zone, the lack of full international participation is not necessarily going to be such a huge disadvantage. I'll tell you why. Because when nobody else in the West wants to buy Iranian oil, and Saudi Arabia is willing to supply the shortfall, countries that are still willing to buy, like China and India, I suspect will go to Iran and say, we're going to buy your oil, but only at a significant discount. And there is evidence that this is already happening. Now, if you have oil at $107 a barrel, like it was in today's market, and Iran's balanced budget is pegged to an $85 a barrel, and China and India go to Iran and say, we'll buy your oil, but you know, we risk incurring sanctions from the United States. The insurance price has gone up significantly because insuring oil transport is sanctionable by the EU and by the United States. No one wants to charter a ship for your own oil, etc., etc., etc. You're going to pay $75 a barrel. That's good enough for me because it means that the regime is earning $32 a barrel or less, which means it has lost a significant amount of revenue that it would otherwise use to pursue its nuclear activities. That's the goal of sanctions. Now, once a year and a half has elapsed, and the regime has not been persuaded to change course, sanctions will start crumbling. A, because they were not implemented with great enthusiasm to begin with. There will be a lot of free riders ready to break them. The regime will have figured out ways, even at the price of reducing the money it puts into domestic needs, to finance its activities even at a greater cost. And the impact of sanctions on the ordinary Iranians will start undermining the base for sanctions. So we have a short window of opportunity. I don't think that sanctions are the ideal instrument. I don't think that sanctions have had such a wonderful success. But I think that they are certainly a preferable option to a military strike. They are a good complement to diplomacy, and they stand still a chance to succeed.